Darwin, Australia, March 1943. Squadron leader Clive Caldwell watches Japanese Zeros weaving through the sky with their legendary maneuverability, waiting to engage Australian fighters in the turning dogfights where they've dominated for over a year. But Caldwell isn't playing that game. He's flying a P-40 Kitty Hawk fighter every expert said was obsolete. Too slow, too heavy, hopelessly outclassed by the Zero. His squadron mates initially mocked it as American junk, a hand-me-down because Britain couldn't spare but Caldwell has discovered something every other Allied pilot missed. The P-40 is ENA trying to outturn the Zero. It doesn't need to. It can outdive it, outgun it at high speed, and absorb punishment that would shred a Zero into burning fragments. Today, he's about to prove that the obsolete Kitty Hawk can do something nobody believed possible. Sweep Japanese aces from Australian skies using tactics that violate every rule of dogfighting the RAF ever taught. The fighter everyone dismissed is about to become a legend. The full story. When tactical innovation transformed a failure into a Zero killer. The arrival of American P-40 Warhawk fighters in Australia during 1942 was greeted with reactions ranging from disappointment to outright contempt by Royal Australian Air Force pilots who'd been expecting Supermarine Spitfires, the iconic British fighter that represented the pinnacle of RAF combat aviation. The P-40, known in Australian service as the Key, had already developed a reputation as a mediocre fighter that had been surpassed by newer designs. American pilots had found it adequate but unexceptional in the early stages of the Pacific War. British evaluation had concluded it was inferior to the Spitfire in virtually every performance category, and when matched against the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter that had established air superiority across the Pacific, the P-40 appeared hopelessly outclassed, slower in level flight, less maneuverable in turning combat, and lacking the climb rate to compete with the Zero's legendary performance. Australian fighter pilots examining their new mounts found much to criticize. The P-40's inline Allison engine made it nose-heavy, affecting handling characteristics. Its maximum speed of approximately 360 miles per hour was adequate but not impressive compared to the latest fighters entering service. Its rate of climb was mediocre, meaning Japanese fighters could often establish altitude advantage before engagements began. The cockpit visibility, while better than some contemporary fighters, wasn't exceptional. Most damning in the eyes of pilots trained in Royal Air Force tradition, the P-40 could eon turn with the Zero-and dogfighting doctrine since World War I had emphasized turning combat as the decisive form of air battle. A fighter that couldn't outturn its opponent was, by conventional wisdom, a fighter that would lose. The Japanese Zero had established itself as perhaps the world's most feared fighter aircraft. Through a combination of exceptional maneuverability, long range, and combat success from China to Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. Its lightweight and large wing area gave it a turning radius that no Allied fighter could match in 1942. Zero pilots had developed tactics that forced opponents into turning engagements where Japanese advantages were decisive. The standard Zero combat approach was to entice enemy fighters into dogfights, then use superior maneuverability to get on their tails and shoot them down with 20mm cannon fire. This approach had worked devastatingly well against every Allied fighter type the Japanese had encountered. And by early 1942, Zero pilots had developed a justified confidence that borders on arrogance about their aircraft's superiority and their own skills. Into this situation came squadron leader Clive Caldwell, a combat veteran who'd earned his reputation fighting in North Africa and the Middle East, where he'd become one of the RAAF's top aces flying P-40 Tomahawks against German and Italian aircraft. Caldwell brought practical combat experience that most Australian pilots in the Pacific lacked, but more importantly, he brought a willingness to question conventional tactical doctrine and develop new approaches based on his aircraft's actual strengths, rather than trying to fight the enemy's preferred battle. When Caldwell examined the P-40 Kitty Hawk's characteristics, he didn't see an inferior fighter trying to be a Spitfire or a Zero. He saw a different kind of weapon that required different tactics. The P-40's actual strengths, Caldwell realized, were being ignored because pilots were trying to dogfight with IT playing to the Zero's advantages while neglecting their own. The Kitty Hawk was heavier than the Zero, which was a disadvantage in turning but an advantage in diving. The P-40 could achieve higher speeds in a dive than the Zero could safely match the lightweight Japanese fighter structure. Could even handle the stress loads that the robust American design absorbs. The P-40's heavier weight also meant it could maintain energy better in vertical maneuvers, using diving attacks and zoom climbs that the Zero couldn't effectively counter. The American fighter's 6 .50 caliber machine guns, while lacking the punch of the Zero's 20mm cannons, had better ballistics at high closing speeds and delivered more sustained fire. And critically, the P-40's rugged construction could absorb battle damage that would destroy a Zero. The Japanese fighter's lightweight design achieved its performance by sacrificing armor protection and structural strength. Caldwell developed tactics that exploited these advantages while avoiding the Zero's strengths. The fundamental principle was simple but revolutionary by RAF standards. Never dogfight a Zero, never try to turn with it, never get slow in a Zero's engagement envelope. Instead, maintain speed advantage, use altitude when available, execute high-speed diving attacks from advantageous positions. Fire during the high-speed pass and then extend away, using the P-40's superior diving speed before the Zero could bring its maneuverability to bear. If the Zero tried to follow the P-40 into a high-speed dive, its lighter structure became a liability. Japanese pilots had to ease out of dives more gently than American fighters or risk structural failure. This meant P-40 pilots could dive away from trouble, extend to safe distance, then zoom, climb to regain altitude for another attack. This tactical approach, which would later be called boom and zoom, and become standard Allied doctrine against Japanese fighters, violated everything RAF tradition taught about air combat. British fighter tactics emphasized sustained turning combat, getting on the enemy's tail through superior maneuverability, and maintaining engagement until achieving a kill. Caldwell's approach was hit and run, make one high-speed attack, then disengage before the enemy could fight back on his terms. Two pilots trained in classical dogfighting. This seemed like refusing to fight properly, perhaps even cowardly. But Caldwell understood that tactics had to match aircraft capabilities, and the P-40's capabilities required a different approach than Spitfires used over Britain. Implementing these tactics required discipline that many pilots initially resisted. Human instinct in air combat is to pursue a damaged enemy or to stay in the fight trying to achieve a kill. Caldwell's tactics demanded that pilots assess results immediately and break off regardless of whether they achieve certain kills, trusting the damage inflicted during high-speed passes would accumulate and that staying in a turning fight risked giving away all their advantages. It required altitude discipline, maintaining energy state, and coordinated squadron tactics where flights would cover each other rather than individual pilots maneuvering independently. It was systematic, calculated warfare rather than the romantic individual combat that fighter-pilot culture celebrated. The proof came in combat over Darwin and New Guinea, starting in 1943, when Caldwell's tactics transformed RAAF Kitty Hawk squadrons from units struggling to survive Zero attacks into aggressive fighter forces that achieved kill ratios that shocked observers in engagement after engagement. Australian P-40 pilots using Caldwell's methods shot down Zeros while suffering minimal losses themselves. The results defied everything pre-war theorists and early war experience had suggested about the P-40's capabilities. Squadrons that had been mauled by Japanese fighters when trying to dogfight suddenly achieved local air superiority using tactics that turned the P-40's supposed weaknesses into tactical advantages. Japanese Zero pilots, accustomed to forcing Allied fighters into turning combat where Japanese advantages were decisive, found themselves facing an opponent that refused to fight on Japanese terms. Australian Kitty Hawks would appear with altitude advantage, dive through Zero formations at speeds that Japanese fighters couldn't match, inflict damage with concentrated machine gun fire, and then extend away before Zeros could bring superior maneuverability to bear. Japanese pilots who tried to pursue found themselves in high-speed dives, where the P-40's structural strength was an advantage, and the Zero's lightweight design was a liability. Zero pilots who tried to climb after diving. P-40s discovered the American fighter's energy retention gave it better zoom climb capability than the Japanese fighter, despite the Zero's better sustained climb rate. The tactical revolution Caldwell pioneered spread throughout Allied air forces in the Pacific as word of Australian successes reached American units still learning to fight the Zero effectively. American P-40 pilots in China, Burma, and the South Pacific adopted similar boom and zoom tactics with comparable success. The P-40, which had seemed obsolete in 1942, became the fighter that taught Allied pilots how to beat the Zero not by matching its maneuverability, but by refusing to fight the battle the Zero wanted and instead imposing a different kind of combat where American advantages were decisive. The tactical lessons learned with the P-40 would be applied to later American fighters like the P-38, P-47, and P-51, creating the doctrinal foundation for American air superiority throughout the Pacific War. Individual, Pilot accounts from Australian Kitty Hawk squadrons describe the psychological shift from viewing the P-40 as inferior to trusting Caldwell's tactics. New pilots arriving with RAF training instincts would initially chafe at the discipline required the order to break off attacks and dive away. Felt wrong to men trained to press engagements. But after seeing the result Zeros falling to diving attacks, squadron mates returning from missions that would have been suicidal using conventional tactics. The tactical conversion was complete. The P-40 wasn't an obsolete fighter being flown by desperate pilots with no better options. It was a specialized tool being used correctly for the first time, and in the right hands with proper tactics, it was devastatingly effective. The engineering characteristics that made the P-40 successful in Caldwell's tactical system were all features that pre-war designers had built into the aircraft, without fully understanding their combat implications. The Curtiss-Wright engineers who designed the P-40 had prioritized structural strength, knowing that fighter aircraft needed to survive combat damage and high-stress maneuvers. They'd accepted the weight penalty of robust construction, which made the P-40 heavier than theoretical optimal designs, but also made it capable of surviving hits and maneuvers that destroyed lighter fighters. The Allison engine's characteristics gave the P-40 good power at lower altitudes, where much Pacific combat occurred, even if altitude performance wasn't exceptional. The armament of 6 50 caliber machine guns was chosen for reliability and sustained fire capability rather than the knockout punch of cannon armament, feature by feature. The P-40's design reflected practical engineering choices that created an aircraft perfectly suited for boom and zoom tactics. Even though those tactics hadn't been fully developed when the fighter was designed, the broader lesson extended beyond the specific case of the P-40 versus the Zero. Caldwell's success demonstrated that aircraft performance specifications, top speed, climb rate, turning radius were less important than how those characteristics were employed tactically. An aircraft with superior specifications could be defeated by an inferior aircraft if the inferior aircraft was flown using tactics that exploited its genuine advantages while avoiding the superior aircraft. As this seems obvious in retrospect, but in 1942, it was a revolutionary insight that contradicted decades of fighter doctrine, emphasizing universal performance characteristics and individual dogfighting skill as the determinants of air combat success. The cultural resistance Caldwell faced from pilots trained in RAF tradition highlighted how institutional doctrine can blind military organizations to tactical innovation. The RFS Fighter Command had developed tactics optimized for Spitfires fighting over Britain tactics that emphasized sustained turning combat because the Spitfire could outturn German fighters. When those same pilots encountered the Zero, they tried to apply the same tactics and discovered that the Zero could outturn them just as decisively as they outturned Germans. The appropriate response was to develop new tactics optimized for different aircraft characteristics. But institutional momentum and cultural attachment to established doctrine made change difficult. Caldwell succeeded partly because he was fighting far from RAF headquarters, giving him freedom to experiment without immediate oversight from commanders wed to conventional approaches. The recognition of Caldwell's achievements came gradually. Official RAF doctrine took time to incorporate lessons from distant Pacific theaters. American fighter units developed similar tactics somewhat independently, with commanders like Claire Chennault in China arriving at comparable conclusions through their own combat experience. The tactical revolution wasn't a single moment of insight, but rather parallel developments by practical combat leaders who trusted results over theory. By late 1943, boom-on-zoom tactics against Japanese fighters had become standard Allied doctrine, and the P-40's reputation had transformed from obsolete hand-me-down to respected workhorse that had taught the Allies how to fight. For the P-40 itself, Caldwell's tactical innovations meant the fighter remained effective far longer than performance specifications suggested it should, even as newer American fighters like the P-38 Lightning and P-51 Mustang entered service with superior performance characteristics. P-40s continued flying combat missions effectively because pilots understood how to use them properly. The Kitty Hawk served throughout the Pacific War in Burma, in North Africa, and in other theaters where its ruggedness, reliability, and suitability for ground attack complemented its air-to-air capabilities. The obsolete fighter that nobody wanted in 1940 proved to be exactly what was needed, not because it matched the enemy's strengths, but because it could be employed in ways that made the enemy's strengths irrelevant. Squadron leader Clive Caldwell himself became one of Australia's top aces, credited with 28.5 confirmed kills, most achieved in P-40s using the tactics he pioneered. His personal success validated his tactical approach, but more importantly, his methods transformed entire squadrons of average pilots into effective fighter units that could compete successfully against elite Japanese opponents. The lesson was clear. Tactics, training, and doctrine mattered as much as aircraft performance, and sometimes the best weapon wasn't the one with superior specifications, but the one used most effectively for its actual capabilities rather than its theoretical performance. The historical irony is that the P-40 succeeded in the Pacific largely because it was not trying to be a Spitfire or compete directly with the Zero-S strengths. It was a different kind of fighter that required different thinking. And once that thinking developed, the obsolete characteristics that everyone had criticized became the foundation for tactical success. The heavy weight that hurt turning performance enabled devastating diving attacks. The structural strength that added weight saved pilots' lives and allowed violent maneuvers lighter fighters could unsurvive. The adequate but not exceptional speed was sufficient when used intelligently rather than squandered in turning combat, feature by feature. The P-40's supposed inadequacies became advantages once pilots stopped trying to make it something it was. UNTN started exploiting what it actually was.